Hello, welcome to the second PDS breakout of the day. You can see our two great speakers there on your screen. I'm going to get to them as quickly as I can because they have a lot of information to share with you, a lot of insights to share with you. Could you move to the next slide, please? Next slide. Okay. We thought calling out next slide would be fail-safe, but unfortunately it's not. Hold on one second. There we are. Okay, and okay, advance to the next one. Advance to Donna's slide. One more. Yeah, let's go right to there. As I said, I want to jump right into these experts, but I will just start by saying where a vision from Project DataSphere is to take a leadership role in the community of data sharing platforms and services and move the goalpost from data transparency and data discoverability to responsible data reuse. There's a big gap there, and we should see that as an opportunity to take much better advantage of the data that already exists. Donna, straight to you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Thank you all for this opportunity to share and be a part of this discussion. I was diagnosed with GIST in 2006, and in August of 2018, I started on a clinical trial in Portland, Oregon. And, you know, I've had various side effects from the medication, but it's working well. And you know, during my visits out there, I've met with others who are on the same trial, and they don't experience the same side effects that I'm having. So I always wonder, you know, is it genetics? Is it something that I'm doing that I shouldn't be doing? Or are there things that I could be doing to mitigate the side effects or at least lessen the impact? But I feel like if data had been shared between the clinical trial, the researchers, between the doctors and the industry, maybe there could have been some insight as to why I experienced what I experienced, and I would have been given information on how to mitigate some of those side effects. But I also believe that data sharing will allow for development of targeted therapies more quickly. I think that if targeted therapy is truly developed for me specifically, it could reduce the number of side effects and work to my advantage to help my disease progression. But I do think that in order to reach that point, data has to be shared between the industry and academia and clinicians so that we can reach that point in an accelerated manner. So this is very near and dear to my heart, that data shared and data is used for the betterment of the patient.
So let me just throw a question in there to just, Donna, give you a little more time here, because I know you have a strong feeling about this. And I'll read you this question. I'd like to hear about informed consent. As a patient, when you sign informed consent, how do you see your data being used? Do you see any limitations of use on this data? Are you worried about patient re-identification?
You know, if the data is used to help another patient, to advance medicine, to make it better for me, I think nothing's a closed book for me. Any relevant data that can be shared to make things better for the next person that gets this disease, I think is relevant. I think that the patient should be first in mind. I don't worry about my information being identified, my name being released or identified, because I am an open book. And if there's something I can help, if there's a way for me to help the next patient feel more comfortable in a clinical trial or advance medicine I'm willing to do that. So I don't have a problem with sharing my data.
Okay. Thanks, Donna. That's great. And so let's jump over to Frank, and we'll jump back to you, Donna, as necessary. But Frank is somebody who's been associated with quite a few data sharing programs and the benefits and challenges of all those. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I assume you can see my slides. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see my slides. Okay. Thank you to Bill. Those are my disclosures. Thanks to Bill, my longtime friend and colleague, and his co-workers for inviting me here today. You can go to the next slide. People can read my disclosures at their leisure. Over the years, there have been lots of calls for open science. It's obviously been in the news a lot more since the Obama administration. But I personally have been working on open science issues since 1990. So this is something that's sort of gained momentum maybe more rapidly. And if you're new to the topic, here are some references that really outline the basic concepts of open science. And I'd say the FAIR principles are probably the best place to start if you're new to it. Next slide. So why, and Donna, by the way, did a fantastic job setting up my talk. I think we're going to have to go on the road together here because her talk matched perfectly with mine. So what does it mean to be open or transparent? And I think, Bill, your long-term vision is exactly on the nose. Openness and transparency are strategies and belief systems. Access and disclosure are tactical steps. So there are mechanics to doing it, but you have to want to be open and transparent in order to make this all work. You can disclose information, but if you don't do it with true transparency, it's not going to help patients. I can hide things in plain sight by putting complicated data out and say I've accomplished my mission, but not be helpful. I'm going to focus here on clinical trials data. And you asked an important question about consent. That's what separates trials data from real world data. Patients in trials consent to have their data used, either directly or implicitly, whereas patients who are going in for healthcare consent to have their data used to take care of them, not necessarily to do research. And that's a very different privacy issue. And openness can really only be achieved if people disclose information in a way that's digestible by the recipient. Next slide. There's a lot of value. The two things I'm going to highlight here, and Donna touched on both of these. One is you can't really look at precision medicine in reusing data from publications or even clinicaltrials.gov or press releases or Facebook or wherever you get your information. The individual patient data, the only way you can actually really study precision medicine to get down to covariates and subgroups. And last but not least, sharing the data honors the commitment to patients who risk their health and lives to be in these clinical trials. Next. As I said, this is a journey. It's been going on for a long time. I'd say a couple of highlights here. You're welcome to read any of the other ones, and I'm happy to provide references if people want them. Trial registration was a big step in 2005, and that's when the journal editors pushed to have clinical trials registered before you could publish them, because they were looking for the hidden trials. And it was later followed by the US Congress. And anytime there's a change in the way we look at information or the way we try to be transparency, there's going to be resistance. And there's certainly resistance to sharing clinical trial data. But if I go back to 2005, there were absolutely vigorous debates where the pharmaceutical industry claimed that by registering their protocols, it was going to destroy their commercial enterprise, and they would not be able to continue to do business. Well, last time I checked, the Earth's still spinning on its axis, and the pharmaceutical business is still moving. So, and that's not the point fingers at the pharmaceutical industry. The point is, anytime you do something new, people are going to resist. Sprint Challenge in 2017 by New England Journal of Medicine was a real pivotal point where New England Journal put the patient's views in front and center. They had patients debating with trialists and with regulators about the importance of sharing and how important it was to patients, and actually had patients challenging very well-known clinical trialists to say, it's not really up to you to hold on to your data just so you can get promoted. And I think that was an important point. Informed consent was a highlight in 2017 when the U.S. Office of Human Research Protection changed the consent rules Up until that time, if an informed consent was silent on data sharing, one could argue the patient had not agreed to do it. The law in the United States has changed now. If the consent form is silent, by definition, the patient is consenting to have their data shared unless it specifically says no. And then there are a lot of other NIH has put out guidelines. Next slide. There are obviously challenges. Patient privacy is an important one. I think Donna did a fabulous job of explaining the patient's point of view here. I think the people who argue what I think overinterpret privacy issues in clinical trials are usually the regulators and the lawyers, but they don't seek input from the patients. Academic credit, there's a lot of academics who don't want to release data because they want to get promoted and they want to get grants, and we're working on that. Duke has changed their promotion policy now. If you share your data and your data gets reused, that counts every bit as much as a citation on a publication. So that slowly we're moving toward helping the academics retain their commercial sensitivity. I don't know of any evidence where data sharing is really created. There might be examples, but it's generally not an issue. Data standards, operability, utility, retaining utility of the data. In order to do some de-identification to protect patients, you remove things like geography and dates. And that certainly does reduce the utility of the data to some extent in order to protect the patient, but it maintains largely the content of the data. So that's a balance we have to strike. Resources does cost money. Complexity of the platforms is an issue, and I think this is part of Bill's vision. Right now, we have lots of platforms, and I'll cover that briefly. But they can be hard to use, and I think they discourage people from reusing the available data. The ability to download data is an important aspect of, and I'll cover that in a second. Next slide. ICMJE, as you all know, if you do any publishing at all, requires you to say whether you're going to share your data before they'll publish your paper. That's any major medical journal in the world. Doesn't mean you have to share it, but if you're not going to share it, you have to publicly state, I'm not going to share it. And that's sort of, I think that's an interesting way to force people to call their shots. Next slide. This was and Donna, again, thank you. You did a fabulous job expressing it better than I could, how patients feel about having their data shared. There are many publications. This is one of my favorites. Michelle Mello, Steve Goodman from Stanford did a large survey of clinical trial patients. And over 90% of the patients said, yes, I accept the privacy risks. Yes, I accept the risk that the information, I'm not going to understand what the people are doing with my information, but I will trust the researchers to do it appropriately. And the overwhelming feeling is that they want to have their data shared, just as Donna indicated. Next slide. So 2013, it was a pivotal moment in this sort of individual data sharing, and Bill and I were both at GSK at the time. I was really proud to be part of this. GSK put all of their individual patient data in the public domain. It took 3 years to get us to that point. And that was a seminal point in basically sort of opening the doors. Next slide. So the good news is lots of other people took up the challenge. We had lots of platforms, many others. I've only listed a few here. Good news, so lots of people are deciding, yeah, we need to share our data. But it was a fractured, disconnected approach. Vivily has tried to link those together to some extent. Well, the jury's still out on that. But the challenges are around the visibility and complexity of the data that are available. You would be shocked to know how few people actually know about the existence of these platforms, and particularly in academia, where people are constantly desperate to get all the data, and yet they don't actually know that there's thousands of clinical trials sitting out there to be used. So I think that's something we need to work on, as Bill said. Next slide. This is sort of a graphic looking at, I have sort of on a scale of openness. So Project DataSphere on the left is one of the most open platforms. It's primarily only the control data, although I know Bill's working to change that. But it's very open, very low hurdles to get in, and you can download the data, which makes it a very useful data. You can get to the data quickly. As I move over to the right, I'm involved in Vivly, I'm involved in SOAR, I was involved in clinical data studyrequest.com. Those have a little bit more of a gatekeeping approach. It takes a little bit longer to get in, and you have to do the analyses in their environment. You cannot download the data for the most part. And I think that what that does is restricts people's, it makes just one more hurdle for them to reuse the data. It's hard to combine data sets. So I think a lot of platforms, but they all have slightly different approaches. And I think in the future, we can hopefully push, I certainly have pushed a lot of these platforms to be more aggressive about allowing people to download data. That will, I think, ease a lot of the complexity. Next slide. Last few slides. I think one of our problems today is that if I look at the population of people who want data and the population of people who are giving it are almost mutually exclusive populations. And so they don't really have an appreciation for each other's issues and needs. So if we go to the next slide, please. I think if we move to this, what'll happen is the data requesters will realize, oh, well, this is really hard. I had to share my data and I understand the problem now. This is not easy. And the data contributors will understand what the data requesters really need because so I think this is part of our problem. We have two different constituencies that don't share an overall vision. And I think we just need to, I think we'll slowly move to that. Next slide. So I do think the benefits outweigh the barriers. I think there are costs, and that's something we need to work on. I think Gates Foundation has made some huge progress there. NIH is slowly moving toward it's a cost of doing research. Yes, it costs money to share your data, but if I run a typical phase 3 trial, which is $150 or $200 million, yeah, so it might cost me a couple $1 million to share the data. It's a rounding error in the clinical trial budget. So yes, it is a lot of money, but it takes focus and talent and skills. The benefits on the left-hand side, I think we've all talked about, and Donna did a nice job summarizing those. Last slide. So we owe it to patients to make these data available. I know I said that several times, but I probably didn't say it enough. We need to view data access effort as a journey. It's been going on for 30 years. It'll go on for longer. It's moved relatively quickly. There are challenges. They're all manageable. There are barriers. I can think of 100 ways why not to share data. But every one of those, I can also think of 100 ways to share data. So I think we need to take the approach of saying, how are we going to honor the commitment to patients? And so let's make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. We have some questions rolling in here. You mentioned, Frank, a minute or two ago about gatekeeper models for some of these schemes. And often a part of that gatekeeping model is the requirement to submit a research protocol to an independent review panel. Do you know, in your experience, do any of those panels have patients or somehow include the patient's voice?
I would say patient voice directly, no. There are some of them have bioethicists that are representing the patient's interest. The problem with having a patient or even a patient advocate is you probably could pull it off for something like Project DataSphere, which is an oncology specific platform, but the rest of the platforms are across the board. I mean, we've got all the way from, COVID to oncology to heart attack to stroke. It would be hard to have a patient representative, I think, to adequately represent all of those. But a lot of the platforms have tried to cover that by having a bioethicist sit on the panel.
Any thoughts on that, Donna? Bioethicist versus, I don't mean versus, I mean a bioethicist kind of representing the views of the patients. Is that effective?
Well, I mean, it would be helpful, but I think that a patient should be involved because a patient can tell you from a personal perspective. And I'm happy to work with any of the platforms in sharing and talking about sharing data and sharing my personal data from my clinical trial.
Thank you, Donna. I'll take you up on that.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
Let's see. Also, another thing you mentioned, Frank, was it's not free to share data. Most people will be surprised at the level of effort it takes to find that data, to get it in the right shape, make sure it's all there, and then ship it off to a data platform. Of course, in the middle of all that, the expensive process of anonymizing it or de-identifying it. So what's but we hear and we know some of the sponsors might not say no, but they have a trickle of money and a prioritization of data sets So that means it's not no, but it'll be a year or two. How do we break through that kind of inertia?
So thanks, Bill. I refer in that part of data sharing to sort of think of picture of an iceberg. So everybody talks about everybody's happy to debate the stuff that's above the water, the policy and the rights and the wrongs and intellectual property and all that stuff. But most of the work is below the water. And so, and that's the stuff people don't want to talk about. It's exactly what you said. I think one of the things that separates industry from academia in this right now is industry, by definition, has to be prepared to share their data with somebody, at least the regulators. So they're already, in a sense, they've got a machine that can share data. Some companies are more willing to do that than others. Some are willing to share all their data, whether drugs are approved or not. Some have restrictions. It has to be 2 years after the trial ends. And some companies have the right to veto. I mean, it's all over the place, but they have the mechanism to do it. Academics, they run a trial, and for the most part, they're writing a trial and they're going to keep the data and they're going to publish it as long, publish manuscripts as long as they can. So it's a shift for them. The National Academy of Medicine meeting we had last fall that you were at, I think the final statement that Jeff Drazen made at the end, which I thought was really summarizes it. If we gain nothing from data sharing, but actually conducting better data stewardship in the first instance, we'll have made huge progress. And the message there is, I think what data sharing will do is it will force everybody who's running a trial at the beginning to say, I'm going to assume someone else is going to want to look at these data someday. So I'm going to collect them, store them, and document them in a way that everybody else can understand them. And I think that will ultimately solve a large part of the cost problem, because what happens is it's an investment that has to happen at the end. You're retrofitting something you didn't think about 2 or 3 years ago. And I think that's part of the problem. There's the emotional part. It's mine and you can't have it. That's a whole different set of issues. But the actual mechanical part, I think we can solve by just teaching people to be better data stewards. So it doesn't solve the cost problem. I mean, Gates Foundation embeds costs now in their grants. NIH is threatening to do that. We'll see how that happens over the next couple of years. So.
Yeah, I think it will take something structural, right? To break through.
Yes.
Donna, you're passionate about your views and the views of a patient, and getting across points on how this can be made, more accessible to more people just by thinking about what it's like for a patient. Do you consider yourself sort of a typical patient, and do most people have your kind of what we would think of as a very evolved view that, hey, use this data. We want you to use this data.
I would hope so, because I think that even when you talk about getting people involved, getting patients involved in clinical trials, finding candidates, I think if the conversation started with, we have treated patients of your genetic background, and this is how it's going to affect you, to be able to help them make a more educated decision, I think that sponsors would be able to gather more, say, African Americans to participate in their clinical trials. And, there's been question about who actually owns the data. In my personal opinion, the patient owns the data. I mean, if you didn't have the patient, you wouldn't have the data to share. We wouldn't even have this conversation. So I think that if a patient really thought about it and looked at it from that perspective, and the fact that, I think we get into this to help others who come behind us, patients who come behind us. So I think if we think about it from that perspective, I would say that there are quite a few patients that will feel the same way as I do. I would hope.
That's a very optimistic view. It gives us energy, Donna, to hear patients say that, and we're here to serve the patient. So that's very inspiring for those of us that are in this business. One thing we've thought about at Project Datasphere, but it's very early days, is whether we can manage this restricted access, open access continuum by thinking of the life cycle of a data set. So, right after a very large, expensive, important randomized clinical controlled database is locked, there are going to be restrictions on that, right? There'll be publications that where you can't expose the data, regulatory reviews. There are legitimate reasons to restrict access. On the other hand, we find companies reticent to share data that's more than 10 years old. So we're trying to figure out if there's a life cycle approach here where people are committed to the idea that eventually data is shared in an open scheme, and there are triggers of time or milestones that cause them to go from restricted access to global access. Just want to get your reaction. Does that sound achievable, or is this just a kind of paper and pencil exercise?
I'll start. I know I absolutely think it's achievable. I think if we don't believe that, I think it's not a very optimistic thought. So if you think about the last couple slides I had with the two circles that weren't overlapping, one of the things that I think we've learned over time is even in the platforms that have a gatekeeper approach. So I chair the IRP for the SOAR platform, Independent Review Panel. But I think in 5 years, I've rejected one proposal because the analysis had already been done and published by somebody else. But what we do is try to help the researchers not waste their time. Sometimes they try to ask questions that the data set's not capable of answering. And so we try to send them a note back saying, hey, you really ought to think about changing your question a little bit, or maybe put these data sets in. So it's not a matter of trying to block them, it's actually trying to help them. So I think if we create more of a spirit of collaboration between the researchers and the secondary users, and right now it is in many cases a bit of an antagonistic thing. I want your data. No, I don't want to give it to you. As opposed to, hey, I have a question maybe you didn't think of. Could we work together on answering it? You understand the data better than I do, but I have a question or I have technical capabilities you may not have. Can we work together? And I think if we can move toward that spirit, we'll get to what you're talking about, because then there'll be much more of an open incentive for people to want to work together. You got to hammer out who gets the publication and the credit and all that. But I think that right now it's too much of a us and them. And I think if we move to more of a collaborative approach, Demetz and Lowe published a nice paper about that in New England Journal a couple of years ago, basically saying there has to be room for everybody to win here.
Okay, thanks. Here's a pretty technical question here in the bin. It's can anonymization or de-identification be standardized so that there's a universal definition which would make all of this more efficient?
So yeah, I sit on the EMA technical group for anonymization, de-identification. We've discussed that many times. I think there are standard probabilistic mechanisms. I think they're out there that you can take to it. I don't know that you can ever completely standardize it because there is a bit of a use context. So if I want to look at adverse events as my primary, I might want to de-identify different fields than if I want to look at efficacy. So if I want to look at adverse events, I might decide, well, I absolutely need to have some dates in there because I can't make the connection. But therefore I have to de-identify some other field in order to protect the patients, the risk to the patients. So I think you can standardize the high-level mechanism. You could standardize the level of risk. EMA has tried to set that at, if the risk is less than 0.09, I don't want to go through the mechanics, but I think you can come up with standard mathematics and programmatic approaches, but I think in the end that you do have to think about the use context in order to protect the patient.
Very good, very good. Well, we are at time. And as I said, we'll respond to the other questions with the help of Donna and Frank and post those. And just finally, thank you, Frank, old friend, and thank you, Donna, new friend. It was a great session. I appreciate it, and we're going to make this happen.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome. Okay, whoever's listening to us, we're out.
Bill out.